What would you do if you knew your family's wealth was slipping through your fingers? If someone you thought you trusted was about to take away everything you've ever wanted? Imagine, for a moment, you've worked your whole life for a chance to inherit your mother's property, only to find out she's made a change in her will, giving everything to the man she's been in a relationship with for years. Suddenly, the future you imagined slips away. The sense of entitlement builds, the resentment festers. And then, the question starts to haunt you. What if you could make sure that money, that property, was truly yours? Would you take matters into your own hands? For Dr. Thomas Kwan, this question didn't just linger in his mind. It became an obsession that led him down a dark path. A path that started with something as innocent as a medical appointment, but ended in a twisted plan to end a life, all to secure his inheritance. What would you do if you had everything to lose, and someone standing in your way? Would you be capable of something unforgivable? Dr. Thomas Kwan had always been a man of reason. His life was rooted in logic, in the principles of science and medicine. As a successful doctor, he'd spent years honing his expertise. His career was impressive, his reputation spotless. But beneath the surface of his polished professional life, a deep-rooted bitterness had been slowly festering. His mother, Jenny Leung, had always been his closest family member. Thomas had been raised in the shadow of her strength and sacrifices. She'd shielded him from the turmoil of her own personal struggles. And though Thomas had always been her pride and joy, something had always felt off between them. The cracks began to show in his early adulthood when Jenny began a relationship with Patrick O'Hara, a man much older than her. Thomas had always resented the idea of another man stepping into their family dynamic, but more than that, he found himself bitterly jealous of Patrick's growing influence over his mother. Patrick was the opposite of everything Thomas had ever been taught to value. Patrick was calm, reserved, almost passive in his demeanor, traits that Thomas found unsettling. Patrick was not someone Thomas could easily categorize. He was a man who came into Jenny's life when Thomas was an adult, and though his intentions seemed genuine, Thomas always saw him as a threat. As the years went by, Patrick became more ingrained in Jenny's life, moving into their family home, and later taking on the role of a quasi-father figure in Thomas's life. While their relationship remained largely cordial, Thomas never could bring himself to fully accept Patrick. The resentment simmered silently, yet it never quite went away. Then, one fateful day, Jenny made a change in her will that would ignite the final spark of animosity. She left a life interest in her property to Patrick. This decision struck Thomas like a physical blow. All of his life he had been told that one day her wealth and property would be his. After all, he was her son. But now, the prospect of inheriting the family estate seemed incredibly distant. In Jenny's eyes, Patrick had become her life partner, someone who was entitled to live out his days in the property they'd built together. Thomas was furious. The inheritance that he had always assumed would be his was now in jeopardy. What would his future look like now? This wasn't just about money. This was about control, about legacy, and a profound sense of loss. His entitlement, ingrained over years of family tradition, was slipping through his fingers, and he was not about to let that happen without a fight. His thoughts darkened. Patrick was no longer just an inconvenience. He had become an obstacle that needed to be removed. Thomas knew that this wasn't just a petty grievance. It was an existential threat to his future. Patrick had to go. The more Thomas thought about the situation, the more determined he became. The logical solution to his problem was simple. Patrick had to be eliminated. But how could he do it without raising suspicion? As a doctor, Thomas had a deep understanding of the human body and its vulnerabilities, but he also understood how careful one had to be when dealing with life and death. Thomas spent weeks obsessing over the idea. He pored over medical journals, examined toxicology reports, and even experimented with different substances. He wasn't just looking for something that could kill Patrick quickly. He wanted something subtle, something that could take root in his body, cause immense suffering, and yet appear completely natural. Something that would fool everyone, including medical professionals. It was during one of his late-night research sessions that Thomas stumbled upon a little-known substance, iodamethane. This chemical was rare, almost impossible to trace in standard blood tests, and capable of causing a particularly aggressive form of necrotizing fasciitis, a flesh-eating disease. The disease would start with a small infection, but soon spread, decimating the body's tissues in a matter of days. It was a slow, painful death. It was perfect. Thomas spent the following days preparing everything meticulously. He created forged NHS documents, arranging a fake appointment for a COVID-19 booster shot. In the midst of the pandemic, home visits for such vaccines were still common. The idea was simple. He would pose as a community healthcare worker, inject Patrick with the deadly substance, and then leave as if nothing had happened. To carry out the plan, he would need to disguise himself. Thomas knew that any mistake could expose him, so he made sure his costume was flawless: a wig, a fake beard, medical mask, and gloves. The role of a healthcare worker suited him perfectly. No one would suspect a doctor, especially one so trustworthy in his field. The plan, while sinister, seemed foolproof. He just needed to wait for the right moment to execute it. On the day of the appointment, Thomas felt the usual mix of nervous energy and cool calculation. His hands trembled slightly as he put on his disguise, but he steadied himself, reminding himself that this was the only way forward. As he made his way to Patrick's house, he kept his thoughts focused on the outcome. When he arrived at Patrick's home, everything was eerily calm. Patrick greeted him warmly, as he always did. He was an older man now, still friendly, but with a certain frailty that came with age. He didn't seem to notice the tension in the air. For Thomas, the mask of professionalism slipped on naturally as he greeted Patrick and explained the reason for his visit. Thomas sat up in the living room, following the procedure he had rehearsed. His fingers shook slightly as he prepared the syringe, filled with the deadly chemical that would soon begin its horrific work. He couldn't help but marvel at the simplicity of it all. Everything seemed too easy. Patrick, sitting there in his chair, never once suspected that the person before him wasn't who he appeared to be. The injection was quick, almost unnoticeable. "All done," Thomas said, smiling through his mask, pretending to be concerned for Patrick's well-being. "You'll feel a little soreness, but that's to be expected." Patrick thanked him and waved him off. He thought nothing of the visit, nor of the strange feeling of discomfort that had begun to settle into his arm. As Thomas left the house, his heart pounded in his chest. The hardest part was over. The rest would unfold according to plan. He couldn't help but wonder, how long would it take for Patrick to realize what was happening? The next day, things started to unravel for Patrick. What initially seemed like a minor side effect from the vaccine quickly escalated into a nightmare. The pain in his arm began to intensify, radiating outward, his skin turning a strange, deep red. By the evening, the discomfort had spread throughout his entire body, and a fever raged through him. Patrick, alarmed, went to the hospital. He didn't know what was happening, but his body felt like it was slowly falling apart. Doctors initially dismissed it as a side effect from the vaccine, but by the time they realized the seriousness of the situation, it was already too late. Patrick was suffering from necrotizing fasciitis, a rare, deadly infection that destroyed soft tissue at an alarming rate. Days turned into a blur of surgeries and treatments. Doctors tried everything they could to save him, but the infection spread like wildfire, eating away at his flesh. It was a race against time, and no one could understand what was causing the infection to spread so rapidly. Jenny was frantic, unable to comprehend how Patrick's health had deteriorated so quickly. Her grief was palpable, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. How could someone who was perfectly healthy one day end up in such a dire state the next? The doctors were stumped. All they could do was treat the symptoms, but no one had a clear explanation. Patrick's condition grew worse, and soon it became a medical emergency, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It wasn't until weeks later that the truth began to surface. As Patrick's condition stabilized, doctors managed to perform a series of tests that identified traces of a rare toxic substance in his system, iodomethane. The realization hit like a ton of bricks. Someone had deliberately poisoned Patrick. The investigation into Patrick's case began in earnest, and soon the police learned about the forged appointment records and surveillance footage from the day of the injection. The man who had administered the shot was none other than Thomas Kwan, Jenny's own son. At first, Thomas denied any involvement. He claimed he had no idea how Patrick could have contracted such a rare infection. But the evidence was undeniable. Surveillance footage from the building showed someone matching Thomas's description entering Patrick's house on the day of the poisoning. The forged documents, the hidden syringe, and the toxicology reports were all pointing straight to him. The police began to piece together the motives behind Thomas's actions. His history with his mother, the inheritance, and his resentment toward Patrick all became central to the investigation. Thomas had meticulously planned every detail, and while it seemed flawless on the surface, the cracks were starting to show. The trial that followed was a spectacle. Thomas's defense team argued that he had been under extreme emotional stress, but the prosecution wasn't convinced. The evidence was clear, and Thomas's cold demeanor only worked against him. His actions, calculated and deliberate, showed a complete disregard for the value of human life. In the end, the jury found Dr. Thomas Kwan guilty of attempted murder. The sentence was harsh, 31 years and 5 months in prison. Thomas's life as he knew it was over. Jenny was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She couldn't comprehend the depths of betrayal her son had inflicted upon her. She had loved him, raised him, and yet he had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. Patrick, though he survived, was never the same. The physical and emotional scars would remain with him for the rest of his life. As for Thomas, he spent his days in prison, the reality of his actions slowly sinking in. Would the wealth he had so desperately sought ever bring him peace? Would anything ever fill the emptiness he had created within himself? His obsession with control had led him down a path from which there was no return, and the question still lingers. What would you do if you thought you were entitled to something and someone else stood in your way? Would you cross that line?